In the deep and mysterious embrace of the ocean, killer whales have always been the majestic and free kings. They swim among the waves and are an awe-inspiring presence in marine ecology. However, there is a killer whale that deviates from the free trajectory of the ocean, and under the trick of fate, it is forcibly pulled away from that vast home, breaking into the human world and setting off a bloody storm there. The killer whale's name is Tilikum, and this is a name that has been mentioned repeatedly in the collision between animal conservation and human interests. In November 1983, in the icy waters of Iceland, a criminal arrest operation quietly unfolded. Tilikum, who was only 2 years old at the time, was ruthlessly taken from the ocean by humans. Its fate was changed forever. It left its familiar marine environment, was imprisoned in a small pool, and began a long and painful life of captivity. At first, Tilikum was housed in a small aquarium in Iceland. The environment was a world away from the vast ocean in which it originally lived. The small pool restricted its space for movement, and the unfamiliar human gaze around it also made it feel frightened and uneasy. A year later, Tilikum was sold to Seal and of the Pacific in Canada. Here it was forced to embark on a career in acting every day. Under the command of the trainer, it repeated those monotonous and dangerous movements, performing day and night just in exchange for that pitiful bit of food. The long hours of high-intensity training and mental stress left Tilikum extremely traumatized, both physically and psychologically, and all this also laid the groundwork for the next series of tragedies. First bloodshed, a nightmare at Seal and of the Pacific. On February 20, 1991, Canada's Seal and of the Pacific was bustling with visitors, laughing and looking forward to the upcoming killer whale show. Trainer Kelty Byrne, as usual, walked to the performance pool with a confident smile, dressed in a brightly colored uniform. She was light and unaware of the impending doom. At the edge of the performance pool, the audience's eyes were firmly focused on her, and Tilikum and 2 other killer whales were also swimming quietly in the water, looking very docile. Kelty expertly gave instructions to the killer whales and began the show. At first, everything went very smoothly, and Tilikum and its companions did all sorts of wonderful moves as instructed, which won a round of applause from the audience. However, at the end of the show, the audience began to disperse, and the previous docile Tilikum suddenly became irritable without warning. Its eyes widened, and its previous calm eyes burned with inexplicable anger at the moment. It wagged its huge tail violently, making a violent splash of water, and rushed towards Kelty at great speed. Kelty's face turned pale with fright, and her eyes widened in horror. She was trying to dodge, but it was too late. Tilikum used its large, hard body to slam Kelty into the water. Kelty struggled desperately in the water. Her hands were waving wildly, trying to grab something to bring herself to the surface. Bubbles kept popping up in her mouth, and she let out a desperate, faint cry. But Tilikum didn't stop there, and it and 2 other killer whales began to swim wildly around Kelty. From time to time, they dragged Kelty deep underwater, putting her under tremendous stress and fear in the dark underwaters. The tourists who had not yet dispersed were stunned by the terrifying scene in front of them. Their smiles instantly froze on their faces, replaced by horror and disbelief. The women screamed and covered their eyes, and the children cried in fright, hugging the adults around them. The seal and was instantly plunged into chaos. People fled in all directions, and the scene was in shambles. Rescuers arrived quickly after receiving the news, but due to the crazy behavior of Tilikum and 2 other killer whales, they simply couldn't get close to Kelty. After a long and painful struggle, Kelty was unable to escape the catastrophe. By the time rescuers finally found a chance to get her ashore, Kelty had stopped breathing. Her body was covered in scars, and her clothes were torn to shreds. The incident plunged the entire Seal and into deep grief and chaos. However, for Tilikum, it was only the beginning of the killing. As a result of the incident, Tilikum was considered a dangerous animal, and his reputation plummeted. In order to avoid further trouble, Seal and of the Pacific decided to sell Tilikum to SeaWorld, Orlando, Florida, USA. There, Tilikum lived in an even more miserable life. In pursuit of commercial interests, SeaWorld trained Tilikum more rigorously. They wanted Tilikum to attract more tourists and make more profits. On July 6, 1999, SeaWorld finally quieted down after a day of excitement. The tourists had all left, and the staff had finished their day's work and were returning home for work. The entire SeaWorld was immersed in darkness and silence, broken only by the occasional sound of wind and waves. It was on this silent night that a man named Daniel Dukes sneaked into SeaWorld. He evaded the patrols of the security guards and crept like a ghost to the pool where Tilikum was. No one knew why he came here late at night, or what was going on in his mind. Maybe he was curious about killer whales, or maybe he had his own ulterior motives, but in any case, his decision ended up costing him his life. When the staff came to the pool to inspect as usual the next morning, they were stunned by what they saw. Daniel Dukes' body floated in the pool, naked and scarred. There was an expression of extreme fear on his face, and his eyes widened, as if he had seen something extremely terrible before his death. Tilikum, on the other hand, wandered silently in the pool, and its eyes seemed to reveal an elusive look that seemed to be both satisfied and angry. The police quickly intervened in the investigation, but the case became confusing, as there were not many useful clues left at the scene. People were frightened and confused by Tilikum's actions, while also questioning the management of the SeaWorld. Why was one guy able to dive into the SeaWorld so easily? Why would Tilikum launch such a deadly attack on a stranger? None of these questions were answered, and Tilikum was shrouded in an even more mysterious and terrifying overtone. After the tragedy, SeaWorld chose to cover up the incident for its own profit, and this shameless approach also laid the groundwork for another bloody case that followed. What really put Tilikum in the global spotlight was the tragedy that shook the world on February 24, 2010. On that day, SeaWorld Orlando was packed with visitors, and the venue was packed. Veteran trainer Dawn Brancheau stood by the performance pool with a confident smile on her face, dressed in neat training clothes. She interacted with Tilikum. The audience was immersed in the performance, and they applauded Tilikum's wonderful performance, and the atmosphere was very enthusiastic. At the climax of the performance, Dawn Brancheau, as usual, reached out and stroked Tilikum's head and gave it instructions. Tilikum responded. As usual, its body was swollen gracefully in the water. Suddenly, Tilikum launched an attack on Dawn. It opened its huge mouth and bit down on Dawn Brancheau's ponytail with lightning speed. Dawn Brancheau didn't have time to react before she was jerked into the water by Tilikum. She struggled desperately in the water. Her hands were tugging hard at Tilikum's mouth, trying to break free of it. Her feet kept kicking and hitting the water, making a big splash. But Tilikum showed no mercy, and it bit down on Dawn Brancheau, dragging her into the depths of the water. The audience at the performance pool was stunned by the sudden scene, and their cheers instantly turned into screams of terror. The children were so frightened that they cried, and the parents clung to their children tightly, at a loss. The entire performance venue was plunged into chaos. People fled the scene, and the order of the scene was completely out of control. Rescuers arrived quickly, but they simply could not get close because Tilikum's attack was so ferocious. Tilikum repeatedly dragged Dawn Brancheau under the water and threw her out of the water, torturing her repeatedly. Her body was tossed around in the water, with multiple injuries on her body, and blood stained the waters around her. After a long struggle, Brancheau eventually lost her life. When Tilikum finally opened its mouth, Dawn Brancheau's body floated in the water. Her skin was already mutilated. Through media coverage, the incident quickly spread around the world and caused an uproar. People were shocked and horrified by Tilikum's actions, while also raising strong questions about SeaWorld's animal show industry. On the one hand, animal protection groups believed that Tilikum's actions were the result of long years of captivity and abuse in the small pool. Tilikum was unable to swim freely and communicate with its companions normally, and it suffered great physical and psychological trauma. This long-term repression and anguish eventually led to its aggressive outbursts. They called on people to pay attention to animal rights, stop the captivity and use of wild animals, and let them return to nature. On the other hand, proponents of animal show industries such as SeaWorld argued that Tilikum's actions were an isolated phenomenon and not representative of all killer whales. They emphasized that killer whales were wild animals with certain dangers, and even in natural environments, incidents of attacking humans could occur. SeaWorld could raise awareness of wildlife conservation by allowing people to better understand these animals through training and demonstrations of killer whales. Killer whales are very intelligent animals that have complex social structures and ways of communicating emotionally. Did Tilikum, just like humans, accumulate negative emotions, such as anger and sadness, during its long captivity? Was its attack a rebellion against this unfair treatment? In 2013, a documentary called Blackfish was released, which brought Tilikum's story to the forefront again. Through a series of interviews and materials, the documentary reveals the dark side behind animal performance industries such as SeaWorld. It shows the pain and suffering endured by killer whales in captivity, as well as the serious effects of these animal performances on the mental and physical health of animals. After the documentary was broadcast, it caused a strong response in society, and more people called for a boycott of animal performances. Under tremendous pressure from public opinion, SeaWorld had to make some changes. They announced the phasing out of killer whale shows and improving the living conditions of killer whales. However, for Tilikum, it all came too late. The long period of captivity had left it physically and psychologically traumatized. On January 6, 2017, Tilikum died alone in the pool of SeaWorld. Tilikum's story shows the serious consequences of human captivity and use of wild animals. Animals belong to nature, after all, and their free predation, reproduction, and death in their own place is the best way for them. If people forcibly interfere in their lives, it will eventually bring disasters on human beings.